I did not believe in miracles until the day the void screamed and something answered that was not a god, not a demon, not a lie wearing faith like a mask, but a man who still believed the future could be saved. And I remember the moment clearly because it began in silence, the kind of silence that only comes before extinction. When the Vox channels were dead and the astropathic choir had burned itself into ash trying to warn terror that another world was falling. When the sky over Hive Tertius on Viridian Ix turned the color of old bruises and the stars flickered as if ashamed to be seen. And I was standing on a cathedral balcony carved from the bones of saints, watching refugees kneel in the streets below, begging an emperor who had not spoken in 10,000 years, and I was thinking with a clarity that frightened me that hope itself had become heresy in the Imperium of man, because hope implied change, and change implied weakness, and weakness was punished more swiftly than treason. The invasion had begun 3 weeks earlier, a slow infection rather than a sudden strike, with cultists first, then warp anomalies, then the unmistakable silhouette of chaos, warbands translating from the immaterium like wounds tearing open reality. And we had fought them as we always did, with prayer litanies recited by exhausted guardsmen, with tanks older than the men who crewed them, with commissars executing anyone who hesitated, and with faith weaponized into something rigid and brittle. And as the days passed, I watched men die, not because they lacked courage, but because they had never been taught that survival itself could be virtuous, only martyrdom. And by the time the enemy breached the outer hives, the population had already accepted their fate, whispering that this was the Emperor's will, that suffering was sacred, that extinction was preferable to doubt. It was then, at the precise moment when the sky fractured into 1,000 impossible angles, and reality folded like paper set aflame, that the thing which would later be called salvation arrived in a way no imperial doctrine could explain, not as a burning angel or a titan of gold, but as a falling star wrapped in red, white, and blue, crashing through the upper atmosphere in a column of controlled fire, striking the ruins of a manufacturing district with the sound of thunder held back for centuries. And I remember how the chaos forces faltered, not retreated, but hesitated, as if something in the warp recoiled instinctively, as if the Imperium itself did not recognize what had just entered the galaxy. When the dust settled and Uzbek's readings stabilized, the picked captures showed a lone figure rising from the crater, shield raised not in dominance but defense, its surface scarred but unbroken, bearing no ocula, no sigil of the Imperium, no runes of chaos, only a simple star. And I felt a chill that had nothing to do with fear, because for the first time in my life I was witnessing something untainted by our endless war, something that had not been shaped by 10,000 years of hatred. And the Vox crackled then, not with Binhoric code or high Gothic catechisms, but with a calm, steady voice, asking if anyone was hurt. The words were simple, almost absurd in their gentleness, and the guardsmen who heard them froze, because no one asked such questions anymore, not in this age, not on a world already marked for purgation. And yet he moved among them regardless, lifting fallen civilians, positioning himself between lost fire and unarmored bodies, absorbing punishment meant for others without demanding praise or obedience. And that was when I understood the true shock of his presence. Not that he could fight, because in this galaxy everyone fights, but that he fought without contempt, without joy, without the numbing certainty that violence was the only language left to us. The Chaos Champions roared challenges and promises of ascension, but he did not answer them with scripture or threats, only with action guided by restraint, striking to disarm, to disable, to protect. And this confused the enemy as deeply as it unsettled us. Because the Imperium teaches that mercy is weakness, and chaos teaches that cruelty is freedom. And here stood something that rejected both, a relic from a forgotten moral universe colliding with ours like an ethical meteor. And as the hours passed and the battle spread through the hive streets, I watched the impossible happen. Guardsmen began pulling civilians toward evacuation routes instead of holding firing lines to the last man. Medicaid units moved without commissars forcing them, and prayers shifted in tone from pleas for martyrdom to desperate requests for survival. And all of it radiated outward from the presence of that single man who refused to accept that this galaxy could not be better. And I remember realizing then that if the Imperium learned of him, truly learned of him, they would not know whether to worship him, weaponize him, or kill him, because he represented a question more dangerous than any demon. What if the way we had been saving humanity was the reason it needed saving at all? As night fell and the fires of the hive painted the clouds in shades of bloodless crimson, he stood atop the wreckage beside me, looking out over a city that still burned but had not yet died. And he asked me, a sanctioned imperial chronicler raised on dogma, whether there was a way to save the rest of the world, not conquer it, not cleanse it, but save it. and in that moment I felt something break inside my soul that no sucker scream could replicate, because I realized that for 10,000 years no one had asked that question seriously, and that the arrival of Captain Steve Rogers into the Warhammer 40,000 universe was not the beginning of a war, but the beginning of a heresy of hope that would shake the Imperium more violently than any chaos incursion ever had. By dawn, the Imperium noticed, because it always does eventually, not through compassion or curiosity, but through deviation, through the simple and terrifying fact that the casualty projections no longer matched the doctrine-approved models, that a city marked for terminal collapse was still transmitting coherent distress calls instead of death screams. And I remember the exact moment the first Mechanicus augur priest arrived, its red-robed form descending from a gunmetal lander like a censer swinging over a tomb, servo skulls orbiting it in anxious patterns, and the way its lenses lingered on the man with the shield for a fraction of a second too long, as if the machine spirit itself was struggling to classify him. Captain Rogers, though the name still felt alien in my mouth, had not slept, had not prayed, had not claimed authority, and this unsettled everyone more than open defiance ever could, because he simply acted, coordinating evacuations with a tactician's precision, yet listening to frightened civilians with the patience of a confessor. And when the tech priest finally spoke, it did so in clipped Binharic cant translated into High Gothic, demanding his designation, his gene seed origin, his chapter, his authorization to operate within an Imperial war zone. And the silence that followed was suffocating, because for the first time an Imperial official was asking questions that had no doctrinal answers. Rogers replied calmly, stating he was a soldier, that he fought to protect people, that he had no chapter, no emperor, no right other than the obligation to do what was right. And I watched the augur array spike violently at that, watched logic and genses and recalibrate, because obligation without command is an impossible concept in the Imperium, and it was then that the first inquisitorial cipher arrived, cold and precise, ordering containment, until threat classification could be determined, and that word containment echoed through me with the same dread as exterminatus, because I knew what happened to anomalies that could not be categorized as loyal assets. Chaos forces pressed the outer districts harder that day, drawn by something like hunger or hatred or perhaps fear, and the fighting grew desperate. But what terrified me more was watching Imperial forces hesitate, torn between obeying orders to fall back and the undeniable proof before them that holding the line without sacrificing entire populations was possible, because Rogers stood where the fire was thick as shield, absorbing warp-tainted munitions that should have atomized him, and I saw guardsmen rally, not because they were threatened with execution, but because someone was standing with them. And this subtle shift rippled outward like a fault line beneath a cathedral, because morale born of trust is forbidden in a system that relies on fear to function. By the third day, Space Marines arrived, their drop pods screaming through the atmosphere like judgment made manifest. Warriors of the Ultramarines chapter, icons of perfect obedience and controlled violence, and even they paused when they saw him, because he was not augmented beyond recognition, not clad in ceramite the thickness of a bunker wall. Yet he moved with a confidence that mirrored their own without mimicking it, and when their captain confronted him, demanding fealty in the Emperor's name, Rogers answered with respect, but without submission, stating that he would gladly fight beside them, but would not abandon civilians to achieve a cleaner tactical victory. And I thought for a moment that this would be where it ended, that this was where the Imperium's immune system would finally reject him. But instead, something unprecedented occurred. The Ultramarine captain hesitated. Not long, not visibly, but enough, because even indoctrinated transhuman demigods could recognize courage when it stood unarmored before them. And so an uneasy alliance formed, fragile as glass, each engagement testing it, each victory making it harder to justify breaking it. Meanwhile, the Inquisition tightened its grip. Surveillance servitors tracking Rogers, constantly psychers, probing the edges of his mind and recoiling not from corruption but from absence, from a psyche that had no war resonance shaped by faith or obsession. And this terrified them more than chaos ever could, because it suggested a human ideal untouched by the metaphysical rot of the galaxy, a soul not screaming loudly enough to be heard by gods. And whispers began spreading through the refugee camps. Stories of a shield-bearer who refused to let children die for strategy, who argued with officers and lived, who treated even the condemned with dignity. And I recorded all of it, knowing full well that my chronicle would be classified, redacted, or destroyed, because narratives like this destabilize empires faster than rebellion. The true turning point came when a Chaos Lord breached the inner sanctum, a towering figure of corrupted ceramite and screaming sigils, its presence warping reality into a fever dream of blood and prophecy. And it declared Rogers an insult to the dark gods, a false idol of a dead age, and challenged him openly, promising apotheosis through slaughter. And Rogers answered by stepping forward alone, shield raised, not proclaiming faith or destiny but simply stating that people were not sacrifices. And the duel that followed was brutal, not for its violence, but for its meaning. Because every blow Rogers struck was precise, defensive, designed to end the threat without indulgence. And when the Chaos Lord finally fell, screaming not in triumph but confusion, something shifted across the warp like a muted thunderclap, as if the galaxy itself had briefly remembered another way to exist. That night, as fires dimmed and evacuation ships lifted civilians toward uncertain safety, I found Rogers standing alone, staring at the stars with an expression that was not victorious but weary. And he admitted quietly that he did not know how to fix this world, only that surrendering to despair was not an option. And I realized then that the Imperium could survive chaos, could survive Xenos, could survive endless war, but it might not survive a man who reminded humanity that it once fought for something other than survival. Because if even one world proved that compassion could coexist with strength, then the lie at the heart of the Imperium that cruelty is necessary would begin to unravel. And that was why, when the Inquisitorial Kill Order was finally drafted, marked with seals older than nations, I knew the real war was about to begin. The order did not arrive with drama, no thunder or proclamation. Only a quiet priority signal embedded inside routine strategic traffic, the kind designed to be overlooked by anyone not conditioned to recognize its weight. And when I decrypted it, my hands trembled not from fear but from recognition. Because exterminatus is mercy compared to what the Inquisition reserves for ideas that refuse to die. And Captain Rogers had become precisely the tan idea, moving faster than any fleet, spreading through whispered testimony and unauthorized picked captures, infecting regiments with the notion that survival without damnation was possible. And the Kill Order framed him not as a traitor or Xenos infiltrator but as an existential anomaly, a destabilizing variable whose continued existence threatened long-term Imperial cohesion. The irony was bitter, because Chaos cultists still roamed the underhives and warp storms still gnawed at the planet's edges. Yet the Imperium's deadliest attention had shifted to the one man who had reduced civilian casualties by orders of magnitude, and I watched the machinery of obedience begin to turn against him with horrifying efficiency. Commissars reasserting control through executions meant to remind guardsmen of their place, sermons growing harsher, emphasizing sacrifice over survival, and Space Marine command structures subtly reoriented to limit Rogers' access to strategic zones under the guise of operational necessity. All while he continued working, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the trap closing around him. The first attempt came disguised as cooperation, an invitation to a joint planning council aboard an orbital strike cruiser. And I remember the way the void outside the viewing ports seemed darker than usual as we docked, as if the stars themselves were holding their breath, and the council chamber was a cathedral of steel and incense, banners of conquest hanging like frozen screams, and Inquisitor Halbricht stood at its center, rosette gleaming, voice smooth as a blade hidden in velvet, praising Rogers' effectiveness while dissecting his methods with surgical precision, asking why he resisted doctrinal purity, why he prioritized civilians over territory, why he refused to acknowledge the Emperor as the ultimate authority. And Rogers answered honestly, calmly, stating that authority without accountability becomes cruelty, that symbols lose meaning when they demand endless blood, and that protecting people was not a tactical choice but a moral one. And I saw the Inquisitor's expression harden not in anger but in certainty, because that was the moment he understood that Rogers could not be re-educated, could not be folded neatly into the Imperium's mythos without breaking it, and so the ambush was triggered, containment fields snapping into place, null rods activating, weapons trained not in panic but precision. Rogers reacted instantly, shield raised, positioning himself between the guns and the mortal crew members who suddenly realized they were expendable collateral. And that was when the truth of his threat became undeniable, because even cornered, betrayed, and facing annihilation, his first instinct was still to protect others. And several Astartes hesitated again, that same fractional pause, because they had been created to embody the Emperor's will. Yet here was a man embodying something older, something dangerously human. The clash that followed was swift and contained. Not a battle but a rupture. Rogers breaking free not to escape alone but to create a corridor for non-combatants, hurling his shield to disable systems rather than kill, absorbing stun blasts that would have dropped an Ogryn. And when he finally fled the cruiser, launching himself into the void to be recovered by a stolen shuttle, the Inquisition declared him officially excommunicate. Extremis, a title reserved for those whose existence itself is a crime, and that declaration echoed across the sector like a death knell for hope, because it transformed him overnight from rumored savior to sanctioned target. The aftermath was worse than the attempt itself, because the Imperium moved to erase not just him but the consequences of his actions, ordering population relocations, rewriting casualty reports, executing witnesses who spoke too freely, and burning archives that contained unfiltered accounts of the campaign. And I survived only because my chronicle had already been fragmented and hidden within data looms too vast to purge efficiently. And even then I felt the eyes of the Ordo Hereticus brushing against my thoughts like cold fingers. Rogers did not vanish, however, and that was the final miscalculation, because instead of fleeing the sector, he began appearing where the Imperium's contradictions were most visible. Penal legions abandoned to delay tyrannid swarms, agri-worlds tithed into famine to meet quotas, frontier systems where Xenos raids were met with indifference because the population was deemed expendably, and everywhere he went the same pattern repeated, not rebellion but disruption. Commanders forced to choose between following orders and watching their men fight better under a different example. Civilians refusing evacuation orders that led only to death, and even a few Astartes chapters quietly altering engagement priorities just enough to save lives without openly defying doctrine, and chaos reacted to drawn to him like a wound that would not fester properly. Demon princes seeking to corrupt him and failing because temptation requires desire, and Rogers desired nothing for himself, only an end to suffering, and that made him invisible to the worst hungers of the warp. I encountered him one final time on a moon stripped nearly to bedrock by industrial extraction, its population scheduled for abandonment after resource depletion. And he was older then, not in years but in weight, carrying the exhaustion of a galaxy on his shoulders. And he asked me if the Imperium could change without tearing itself apart. And I could not answer, because I had seen the truth too clearly, that systems built on fear cannot be gently reformed, only resisted until they either adapt or collapse. And as I left him there, organizing an evacuation the administratum had already written off as impossible, I understood that he was not trying to save the Imperium, not really, but to save humanity from it if necessary. And that was why both the Emperor's servants and the Dark Gods feared him, because he represented a future where humanity did not need to be ruled by gods, false or otherwise. And as the stars burned cold and uncaring above us, I realized that whether Captain America lived or died mattered less than the fact that he had existed at all, because once hope has been witnessed, truly witnessed, it cannot be fully exterminated, no matter how thorough the purge. History will record this phase as a series of minor anomalies, footnotes in campaign ledgers and marginalia, scratched out by administratum clerks who never looked too closely at what they erased. But I lived it. And I know that this was the moment the galaxy began to push back, not against chaos or Xenos or even the Imperium itself, but against inevitability, because Captain Rogers did not ignite a revolution, did not raise banners or declare manifestos, and that was precisely why he was so dangerous, because inevitability relies on predictability, and he remained stubbornly, infuriatingly human. The Inquisition escalated quietly at first, deploying kill teams masked as chaos purges, spreading counter-narratives that painted him as a psycho aberration or a Xenos construct designed to undermine faith. And yet none of these explanations held for long, because those who encountered him felt something doctrine could not suppress. A strange recalibration of priorities where survival no longer felt shameful and compassion no longer felt treasonous. And I watched entire regiments fight harder not because they expected salvation but because someone had shown them that their lives mattered beyond their utility. The Imperium responded as it always does when certainty fractures, by tightening control, increasing tides, accelerating purges, and declaring entire systems irredeemable rather than admitting miscalculation. And this backlash caused more suffering in months than some wars did in decades, which Kea delighted in, feeding on despair amplified by betrayal. Yet even the warp seemed unsettled, because demonic manifestations grew erratic around Rogers' operational zones, rituals misfiring, prophecies contradicting one another, as if the Imperium itself struggled to contextualize a soul that did not resonate with obsession, ambition, or terror. There was a confrontation, eventually, one that the Ordo Malleus hoped would end the anomaly decisively, orchestrated on a shrine world whose population had been deliberately allowed to fall into heresy so that a massive chaos incursion could be baited, the logic being brutally simple: draw Rogers in, overwhelm him with both demonic and imperial force, erase him along with all witnesses, and sanctify the ashes. And when he arrived, too late to prevent the initial slaughter but soon enough to change its trajectory, The sky above the planet split into a screaming wound of unreality, demons spilling through like spilled ink, and I saw Rogers hesitate for the first time, not out of fear but grief, because he understood the trap instantly, understood that this world had been sacrificed by both sides to eliminate him, and yet he stayed, because leaving would have meant abandoning those still alive, and the battle that followed defies easy categorization, not because of its scale but because of its refusal to conform to narrative expectations. Rogers fighting alongside Sisters of Battle whose hymns cracked with doubt, guardsmen whose commissars lay dead not by his hand but by chaos claws they could not escape, and even a lone grey knight who watched him carefully, measuring not his strength but his soul. The demons screamed his name though he had never given it to them, and they offered him dominion, escape, the power to remake the galaxy properly this time, and he rejected them without ceremony, without outrage, simply stating that power which demands the suffering of innocence is already failure. And something in the warp recoiled violently at that, because chaos understands defiance but not indifference to temptation. The decisive moment came not with a killing blow but with a choice, when an inquisitorial cyclonic charge was activated prematurely, condemning the entire shrine world to destruction to ensure no evidence survived, and Rogers realized there was no way to stop it, only to delay it long enough for evacuation, and he chose without hesitation, holding the breach against impossible odds, shield cracking for the first time under pressure that bent reality itself, and I saw Space Marines turn back from extraction to join him, saw Sisters drag civilians toward Thunderhawks instead of shrines, saw a grey knight break protocol to cover refugees rather than pursue a greater demon, and for a brief, blinding span of time, humanity acted not as an empire or a cult but as a species that refused to go quietly. When the cyclonic fire finally consumed the world, Rogers was at the epicenter, silhouette framed against annihilation, and for a terrible, endless second I believed that was the end. That hope had been snuffed out like every other aberration before it, but there was no body, no relic, no confirmation, only absence, and absence is the most dangerous outcome of all because it allows belief to persist unchecked. In the aftermath, the Imperium declared victory, chaos declared a glorious martyrdom denied, and the truth slipped between both narratives like water through clenched fists. Because Rogers did not become a legend in the traditional sense, did not crystallize into a symbol that could be controlled, but into a question that refused resolution, appearing in fragmented reports, half-seen pics, improbable survivals attributed to luck or coincidence, and I continued my work quietly, chronicling what I could, knowing that my survival depended on restraint, because the greatest threat to the Imperium was no longer a man with a shield but the growing realization that its cruelty was a choice, not a necessity. I am older now, and the galaxy is still burning, because change on this scale does not come swiftly, but when I hear guardsmen speak of protecting one another instead of earning glorious deaths, when I see commanders hesitate before ordering total annihilation, when I encounter children who believe adulthood is something they might actually reach, I know that something fundamental shifted, that Captain America did not save Warhammer 40,000 in the way stories usually mean, but he saved it from absolute moral entropy, from the lie that humanity must become monstrous to survive monsters, and that is why the Inquisition still hunts his shadow, why chaos still rages at his memory, and why, deep within the Imperium's ossified heart, a heresy persists that no purge has yet extinguished, the belief that humanity can be better, even here, even now, even at the end of everything. In the end, there was no revelation, no throne room confrontation, no moment where the galaxy collectively inhaled and chose a brighter path. Because Warhammer 40,000 does not change that way. And perhaps that is the final lesson Captain Rogers left behind, that salvation here would never be clean or complete, only incremental, fragile, and endlessly contested. And I learned this in the quiet years after his disappearance, when the wars continued as they always had, but felt subtly, unsettlingly different, like a familiar hymn sung in a new key. The Imperium officially declared the anomaly resolved, its records sealed and its name stricken from accessible archives. Yet suppression breeds curiosity, and curiosity breeds memory. And memory is far harder to kill than men, because stories of the shield-bearer persisted not as sermons but as habits. Officers quietly reallocating resources to evacuations before bombardments, Medicae ships arriving sooner than doctrine demanded, commissars hesitating just long enough to let a wounded guardsman live, and these moments were never attributed to him directly, because that would have been dangerous, but they carried his imprint all the same, like fingerprints on a weapon no one admitted to wielding. Chaos adapted to, as it always does, attempting to twist his legacy into something corrosive. cultists preaching false doctrines of a savior who would return to burn the Imperium down, demon lords claiming dominion over his symbol, but these narratives never quite took hold, because they required hatred, and hatred had never been his currency, and without it the warp's distortions rang hollow, failing to anchor themselves in belief strong enough to persist. I was summoned once many years later to testify before a conclave so secret that even the Inquisition pretended it did not exist. A gathering of minds tasked not with judgment but risk assessment, and they asked me the question that had haunted them since the first reports. Did he weaken the Imperium? And I told them the truth as plainly as I could, that he weakened its certainty, not its strength, and that these were not the same thing. Because certainty breeds stagnation, and stagnation breeds collapse. And the silence that followed was the most honest response I ever received from power, because none of them could refute it without dismantling the foundations of their own authority. Worlds still burned, of course, and billions still died, because one man cannot undo 10,000 years of institutionalized despair. But there were exceptions now, anomalies within anomalies, planets that endured not because they were strategically vital but because someone chose to try, regiments that rotated off the front instead of being expended to the last, Space Marine chapters whose battle doctrines quietly emphasized defense of population centers alongside extermination of threats, and none of this was credited to Captain America, because the Imperium cannot canonize what it does not understand. But that anonymity was perhaps his greatest protection, allowing his influence to spread without crystallizing into something that could be hunted and destroyed. As for him, sightings remained inconsistent and unverified. A figure glimpsed at the edge of disaster zones, a shield deflecting a killing blow meant for refugees, a voice over broken Vox channels urging coordination instead of sacrifice. And I no longer tried to confirm these accounts, because certainty would have diminished them, turning a living question into a fixed answer, and the galaxy does not need more fixed answers, only better questions. I sometimes wondered whether he aged, whether the weight of this place eventually broke him, whether he regretted staying when escape might have been possible. But every time those thoughts surfaced, I remembered the look in his eyes on Viridian IX, that quiet resolve untouched by triumph or despair, and I understood that regret implies an alternative he would have chosen, and there was none, because he was never here to win, only to stand where someone needed to stand and refuse to move. The Ecclesiarchy denounced his philosophy as corrosive individualism, the Mechanicus classified him as an unsolved anomaly, the Inquisition maintained open warrants that grew colder with each passing decade, and chaos continued to rage at his absence like a predator denied its prey. Yet humanity, fractured and brutalized as it remained, carried forward something it had nearly forgotten, the idea that survival did not have to be synonymous with damnation. And that idea manifested not in grand reforms but in countless small acts of defiance against despair, moments so mundane they escaped notice. A soldier sharing rations, an officer choosing evacuation over glory, a civilian daring to believe tomorrow was not a lie. I write this now knowing full well that my chronicle will never be widely read, that it may be destroyed moments after completion, and that is acceptable, because this was never meant to be scripture or propaganda, only testimony, a record that somewhere in the darkest age imaginable, a man from another universe stepped into our endless war and refused to let it redefine what it meant to be human. And whether Captain America still walks among the stars or finally fell beneath their weight no longer matters, because the galaxy cannot unsee what he proved. That strength without mercy is not strength at all, that order without conscience is merely organized cruelty, and that even in a future where there is only war, the act of protecting one life without expectation of reward is a rebellion powerful enough to echo across eternity. And so when people ask quietly, carefully, in places where listening devices are unlikely whether Warhammer 40,000 was saved, I answer as honestly as I can, no, not saved, but reminded, and sometimes remembrance is the first and most dangerous step toward change. They never found him, and that absence became a problem no ledger could balance. Because the Imperium is built to hunt targets, not possibilities, and years after the Shrine World burned, I began to notice a strange pattern in the void routes I was assigned to audit, a statistical ghost moving against probability worlds, surviving where projections demanded collapse, refugee convoys slipping through war zones untouched, kill orders arriving just late enough to be irrelevant, and always, when I followed the threads far enough, there was the same residue left behind. Not symbols or slogans, but outcomes that should not have existed, lives preserved where none were required to be. And I realized then that Captain Rogers had adapted to the galaxy far better than it ever adapted to him, because he learned what the Imperium never could. That change here must be quiet to endure, invisible enough to avoid canonization, because once something is named in this age, it becomes either weapon or corpse. The final confirmed encounter I recorded came from a frontier system so insignificant it barely warranted a name, where an orc had stalled inexplicably after weeks of unstoppable advance, its momentum broken not by superior firepower but by coordination, failures, ambushes that prioritized civilian extraction over decapitation strikes, and when the surviving guardsmen were questioned, they spoke of a blue star man only in private, only when they believed no one official was listening, describing how he had taught them to fight defensively without shame, to retreat without disgrace, to treat survival as a strategic victory rather than a moral failure. And these men were not rebels or philosophers, just exhausted soldiers who had been shown a different way to endure, and that terrified the Departamento Munitorum far more than any orc victory ever could, because armies trained to value life fight differently, and differently is dangerous. Chaos reacted last, as it often does, slow to understand wounds that do not fester, and I witnessed warp disturbances flatten instead of escalate around regions rumored to be touched by his passage, demonic incursions collapsing without crescendo, as if denied the emotional resonance they required to fully manifest. And I came to believe that Captain Rogers had achieved something no psyker or saint ever had, not by force but by presence, dampening the galaxy's constant scream just enough for humanity to hear itself think, and that, more than any battle won, was his true legacy.